They invited me into that meeting to erase me. My own family sat there with calm smiles, already planning my removal. They judged me, whispered about me, and then told me to wait outside in front of everyone, as if I had no power left. What they didn't know was this: while they were celebrating my fall, every decision they were making was already meaningless. Minutes later, the room fell silent. Because I wasn't being pushed out, I was about to take everything from them. Subscribe now. This isn't a soft story. This is about cruelty, betrayal, and a revenge so clean. It left powerful people begging in silence. I walked into that meeting knowing my name was on the invitation, but feeling like my presence was a problem they hadn't planned to solve politely. The room went quiet in a way that felt practiced, not respect, control. Chairs shifted, eyes lifted briefly, then slid away. I recognized every face, not because they were important, but because they were family, the kind that shares blood, not loyalty. A few of them smiled, tight smiles, the kind that don't reach the eyes. Others didn't even try. Their expressions were already decided, already closed. I had built this company slowly, carefully, while they watched from a distance, waiting, calculating, convincing themselves that one day it would all belong to them simply because of our last name. I took my seat, but the conversation didn't slow or soften. No greeting, no acknowledgement. It was intentional. They wanted me to feel late, out of place, smaller than the room. I stayed still, my face calm, even as something inside me tightened. This wasn't a discussion. It was a performance, and I wasn't the lead. I was the target. I heard my name in whispers, followed by quiet laughter that stopped the moment I looked up. Glances passed between them, quick and confident, like signals. I had seen this before in hostile negotiations, but never among people who once sat at my family table. That realization hurt more than I expected. One of them finally met my eyes and gave a brief nod, as if granting permission for me to exist there. That's when it clicked. I wasn't invited to contribute. I was invited to watch, to be present while they rewrote my future without me. I sat back, listening, observing every detail. My heartbeat stayed steady, but my instincts were loud. Something was wrong, quietly wrong. And whatever they had planned, it wasn't small. I didn't have to lean in to hear it. Their voices carried just enough to make sure I caught pieces of what they were saying, while still pretending it was none of my business. My name slipped between sentences like something unpleasant, a mistake, a delay, a problem that needed solving. They spoke in half-phrases and coded smiles, the way people do when they believe the outcome is already settled. They thought I was weak, not because I lacked skill, but because I didn't fight loudly, because I didn't interrupt or demand attention. In their minds, silence meant surrender. They mistook patience for fear, restraint for ignorance. I could see it in the way they leaned back in their chairs, relaxed, already enjoying a victory they hadn't earned yet. As the discussion continued, the plan became clearer. They weren't here to debate strategy. They were here to remove me, to push me out quietly, cleanly, without making it look personal. A change in leadership, a restructuring, words designed to sound professional while cutting me out of everything I had built. They spoke about the company as if I were already gone, as if my presence was temporary, insignificant. What hurt wasn't just the betrayal. It was the confidence with which they believed I had no power left. They assumed I'd exhausted every option, that I'd already lost control without realizing it. In their eyes, I was outdated, soft, replaceable. They believed all they had to do was finish what they'd started, and I would disappear without resistance. One voice guided the room more than the others, a relative who had always smiled the widest and envied me the most. Every suggestion came from them. Every subtle attack carried their tone. They framed it as concern, as responsibility, as what was best for everyone. But I knew that voice. I'd heard it growing up, always calm, always convincing, always hiding something sharp underneath. I stayed quiet, letting them talk, letting them believe I didn't understand what was happening. My face gave them nothing. Inside, I was putting the pieces together. They weren't just underestimating me, they were counting on it. And that was their biggest mistake. They didn't start with shouting. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they used smiles and soft voices, the kind that pretend to be respectful while cutting deeper than anger ever could. One of them interrupted me the moment I began to speak, not sharply, just enough to make it seem accidental. An apology followed, thin and unnecessary. The message was clear. My voice wasn't welcome. When I tried again, someone laughed. Quietly. Not at a joke, at me. Another relative leaned back and said something about experience and modern leadership, words chosen carefully to imply I had neither. They brought up old decisions, framed as concerns, dragging my past into the room like evidence in a trial I hadn't agreed to attend. Each sentence was polished, rehearsed, designed to sound reasonable while tearing me down piece by piece. I could feel eyes on me now, not curious, judging. Watching to see how I'd react, waiting for cracks. They spoke over me freely, correcting things I hadn't even finished saying. One of them summarized my own work back to me poorly, then looked around for approval. A few nods followed. That hurt more than the words themselves. What made it cruel wasn't just the disrespect, it was how public it was. Nothing whispered anymore. Every doubt about me was placed on the table like fact. They questioned my decisions, my authority, even my right to sit there. And all of it was done calmly, professionally, as if humiliation were simply part of the agenda. I realized then that this was intentional. They wanted me small, unbalanced, defensive. If I argued, I'd look emotional. If I stayed quiet, I'd look weak. It was a trap built by people who knew exactly how to hurt me without ever raising their voices. My hands rested still in front of me. I kept my posture steady. Inside, something cold settled in. Not fear. Clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an execution, dressed up as a discussion. They weren't testing me. They were displaying me. And the more they pushed, the more certain I became that they believed this was already over. They were wrong. The room didn't explode. It tightened. Voices lowered, glances sharpened, and then came the sentence they had clearly rehearsed. It was delivered calmly, almost kindly, which somehow made it worse. One of them looked at me, not with anger, not with doubt, but with certainty. The kind that assumes authority without earning it. They said it would be better if I waited outside for a moment, just for clarity, just to let the others finish a few things. There it was, the final insult, not hidden, not softened, said clearly enough for everyone to hear. No one objected, no one shifted uncomfortably. A few avoided my eyes. Others watched closely, like spectators waiting to see if I would break. I felt it then, not embarrassment, not shock, but the sharp awareness of how far they were willing to go. This wasn't about efficiency or order. This was about power, about reminding me, publicly, where they believed I belonged. I stood slowly. Every movement felt measured, intentional. I could sense security watching from the edge of the room, already alerted. That detail stayed with me. They hadn't just planned this moment. They had prepared for it. They wanted witnesses. They wanted control. As I walked toward the door, I heard a quiet breath of laughter behind me. Not loud enough to challenge, just enough to sting. I didn't turn around. I didn't say a word. Silence was the only response that didn't give them what they wanted. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The hallway was empty, cold, bright. I stood there alone, exactly where they had placed me. Outside the room, outside the decision, outside the future they were designing without me, and yet, standing there, something unexpected happened. The pressure lifted. The humiliation stayed behind that door. Out here, I could think. Out here, I could breathe. They believed this moment proved their strength. They believed removing me from the room removed my power. They were wrong, because as I stood there, listening to their muffled voices continue without me, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't the end of my authority. It was the moment they exposed their desperation. People don't push someone out unless they're afraid of what that person can still do. I waited, calm, silent, not because I had no choice, but because I did. Standing there in that quiet hallway, I let them believe the story they'd written about me, that I was stunned, that I was finished, that being asked to step outside had stripped me of whatever authority I once had. Inside that room, they were probably congratulating themselves already, mistaking my silence for defeat. What they didn't know was that I had learned long ago to prepare in silence. Months before this meeting, I had sensed the shift, the sudden interest, the forced concern, family members who had never cared about the business asking too many questions, requesting access they didn't need. I hadn't confronted them. I hadn't warned them. I had simply listened, watched, documented, and quietly moved pieces into place while they underestimated me. They didn't know about the decisions I'd made when no one was watching. The agreements signed in rooms where my name wasn't whispered, but respected. The authority I'd secured without announcements. I had learned that real power doesn't arrive loudly. It settles quietly, then waits. They thought I'd lost control because I stopped fighting them openly. They believed I'd grown tired, soft, distracted. What they failed to understand was that I stopped reacting because I no longer needed to. Every move they were making now was late. Every plan they were celebrating had already been accounted for. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to focus. Inside, my mind was calm, steady, clear. I replayed every conversation, every look, every calculated insult, not with anger, with precision. They had shown me exactly who was leading the attack, who was following, and who was simply too afraid to speak. The irony almost made me smile. They believed pushing me out of the room meant pushing me out of the company. They believed authority lived in chairs, votes, and loud voices. They didn't understand that the foundation had already shifted beneath their feet. I checked the time. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew what came next. The longer they talked without me, the deeper they were sinking into a decision that would soon unravel. Out there, alone in that hallway, I wasn't waiting for permission. I was giving them time to finish making the biggest mistake of their lives. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I knew how they operated when they thought they had won. Confidence would turn careless, voices would grow louder, caution would disappear. People who believe they're untouchable always rush the ending. Through the door, I could hear it. The shift. Laughter, no longer restrained. Someone speaking too fast, too proudly. They were celebrating before the result was final. I imagined them leaning back in their chairs, convincing each other that removing me had been the hardest part. Now all that was left was paperwork, formalities, signatures. They began speaking freely, too freely. I knew they were rewriting roles, assigning authority, dividing what they assumed would soon be theirs. They talked about the company as if it were an object already placed on the table, waiting to be claimed. Not once did they question whether they still had the right to make those decisions. That was their mistake. They assumed the room itself gave them power, that as long as they were inside and I was outside, control had shifted. They believed urgency worked in their favor. The faster they moved, the less time there would be for anything to go wrong. They didn't pause to verify. They didn't slow down to confirm. They trusted each other, people bound by ambition, not loyalty. I knew exactly who would push them forward. The same relative who had guided the conversation earlier. The same voice that always framed risk as courage and recklessness as leadership. That voice would insist they finalize everything now before doubt could enter the room. And the others would follow, relieved to let someone else take responsibility. They didn't realize that every decision made without me present carried no weight, that every confident signature meant nothing, that the structure they were so sure they controlled no longer stood the way they thought it did. I could almost see it, the moment when someone hesitated, asked a quiet question, and was brushed aside. Doubt doesn't disappear in groups. It gets silenced. And when that happens, mistakes multiply. I stayed where I was, listening, patient, letting them lock themselves into choices they couldn't undo. They thought pushing me out had weakened me. In truth, it had freed them to expose everything I needed to see. Inside that room, they weren't securing their future. They were documenting their downfall. The door opened sooner than I expected, not because they were ready, but because something had gone wrong. I could tell by the way the voice sounded when my name was called. It wasn't confident anymore. It was careful, controlled, the kind of tone people use when they realize they may have miscalculated. I walked back in without rushing. Every step felt steady, deliberate. The room looked different now, not physically, but emotionally. The air was heavier. Conversations stopped the moment I entered. Chairs that had been relaxed were suddenly upright. Smiles disappeared. Eyes avoided mine, then returned quickly, searching my face for clues. Something had shifted, and they felt it. The relative who had led the attack earlier didn't meet my eyes this time. Their confidence had thinned, replaced by irritation they tried to hide. Papers were spread across the table, too many of them. People don't pull out that much documentation unless they're trying to fix something that's already cracked. I took my seat without being asked. No one stopped me. That silence said more than any apology could have. Someone cleared their throat and began explaining, slowly, carefully. They talked about timelines, assumptions, technicalities, words stacked on top of words, hoping to bury the truth underneath. I listened without interrupting, letting them fill the space with explanations no one had requested. Then I noticed it. The small detail that told me everything. A document pushed slightly out of alignment. A signature missing where it shouldn't have been. A glance exchanged between two people who suddenly understood the same problem at the same time. Their plan had depended on speed, on pressure, on keeping me out long enough to force decisions through. But in their rush, they'd overlooked something essential. They had assumed I was no longer necessary. They had assumed wrong. The room was quiet now, not tense, uncertain. They were waiting. For anger? For protest? For emotion? Something they could react to. I gave them none of it. I spoke calmly, clearly. Just enough to point out what they had missed. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply stated facts they could no longer ignore. With every sentence, the color drained from a few faces. One person leaned back slowly, as if the weight of realization had finally reached them. They had spent the entire meeting trying to remove me, and in doing so, they had reminded themselves exactly why they couldn't. The power in the room didn't explode. It shifted, quietly, completely, and this time, it settled where it belonged. They were still trying to recover when I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need volume. It only needs space. And suddenly, I had all of it. I told them there was something they needed to understand before the meeting went any further. A pause followed. No one interrupted this time. No one smiled. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had drained away, replaced by something close to fear. I explained calmly that the structure they were operating under no longer existed in the way they believed, that changes had been made months ago, quietly, legally, permanently. I didn't list details at first. I let the uncertainty do its work. People shifted in their seats, pens stopped moving. Someone glanced at the documents again, this time with panic instead of pride. Then I said it plainly. The authority they were trying to vote away wasn't theirs to touch. The decisions they thought they were finalizing required my approval, not as a courtesy, not as a formality, but as a requirement. Without it, nothing they'd discussed held any weight. One of them laughed nervously, not because it was funny, but because they hoped it was. Another asked a question they already knew the answer to. I watched the realization spread slowly, unevenly, like cracks forming in glass. Some understood immediately. Others resisted it, clinging to assumptions that had protected their arrogance until now. The relative who had led the attack finally spoke. Their voice was careful, almost gentle. They asked when these changes had happened. I met their eyes for the first time that day and answered without hesitation. Not recently, not in reaction to this meeting, long before they believed they needed to move against me. That was the twist they hadn't planned for. They had built their strategy around the idea that I was always one step behind, reacting, adjusting, defending. They never considered that I might have been ahead the entire time, that while they were watching me, I was watching them more closely. Silence returned, heavier than before. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said. They had underestimated me in every possible way, and now they were sitting in the consequences of that mistake. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply waited, because now they were the ones who had nothing left to do but listen. I could have ended it there. I could have let the silence stretch and walked away with quiet victory. But what they had done wasn't just strategic. It was personal. It was calculated cruelty. And I had learned something important about power. If you don't define the ending, someone else will try to rewrite it. So I continued. I addressed the room without raising my voice, without emotion clouding my words. I reminded them of the way this meeting had started, the looks, the interruptions, the decision to remove me from the room as if I were an inconvenience instead of the foundation. I didn't accuse them directly. I didn't need to. I simply described the sequence of events as they happened. Facts have a way of feeling cruel when there's no excuse left to hide behind. Then I began to act. I explained which agreements would no longer move forward, which partnerships were being dissolved, which leadership roles would be reevaluated, effective immediately. Names weren't shouted. They were spoken clearly, carefully, one by one. Each word landed with precision. Chairs shifted. Breathing changed. Someone tried to interrupt me and stopped halfway through the sentence, realizing they no longer had the authority to do so. The relative who had led the attack went still. I turned to them last. I explained that trust, once broken at this level, doesn't heal with apologies. That influence built on manipulation collapses the moment it's exposed. I didn't remove them with anger. I removed them with certainty. That, more than anything, broke them. This wasn't revenge fueled by rage. It was correction, alignment. The removal of people who believed cruelty was a strategy and arrogance was strength. I wasn't humiliating them the way they had tried to humiliate me. I was doing something far worse in their eyes. I was making them irrelevant. No shouting followed, no dramatic exits, just quiet understanding settling across the table. They had pushed too far, misread the moment, and underestimated the person they believed they could control. I paused when I was done. Not for permission, but to let it sink in. They had asked me to wait outside. Now they were the ones sitting still, powerless, watching the future move forward without them. And for the first time that day, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because I had won, but because I had ended it on my terms. I let the silence breathe, not to be dramatic, but because endings deserve space. Faces around the table were frozen between disbelief and calculation, searching for a way back into control that no longer existed. They were waiting for mercy, for a pause they could turn into negotiation. I gave them neither. I stood, not abruptly, just enough to change the balance of the room. When I spoke again, my voice was steady, almost gentle. I told them there would be no revisiting what had been decided today. No follow-up meetings to soften the outcome, no private conversations to reshape the narrative. This wasn't punishment, it was consequence. I reminded them, calmly, of the moment that defined everything, the request that had been made in front of everyone, the one that revealed how easily they dismissed what they didn't understand. I didn't repeat the words exactly. I didn't need to. They remembered. I could see it in their eyes. Then I said the line that ended them. I told them that power doesn't vanish when you step out of a room. It vanishes when you forget who built it. That asking me to wait outside hadn't diminished me. It had exposed them. And exposure, once it happens at this level, is irreversible. One of them tried to speak. I raised a single hand. Not aggressively, just enough. The room went quiet again. I told them the future of the company would move forward without bitterness, but not without boundaries. That trust would be rebuilt, with new people, new standards, and no exceptions for blood or history. I looked directly at the relative who had led the attack. Their composure finally cracked, not loudly, subtly, the way people break when they realize there's no argument left to make. I told them they could keep their pride or their position, but not both. The choice had already been made. I gathered my papers and turned toward the door. This time, no one asked me to wait. No one followed. No one spoke. The room stayed exactly where it was, silent, stunned, and suddenly very small. As I walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished tolerating. Finished shrinking to make others comfortable. They thought the meeting would end with my removal. Instead, it ended with my line and their collapse. And I never looked back. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel light. I felt clear. There's a difference. Victory doesn't always come with relief or joy. Sometimes it comes with understanding, sharp, permanent, and impossible to unlearn. That day taught me that power isn't loud. The people who talk the most are usually trying to convince themselves. Real power waits. It watches patterns. It moves only when the outcome is already decided. I had spent years believing that fairness would protect me, that shared history would matter, that blood would slow betrayal. I was wrong. What protects you is preparation. I learned that silence is dangerous only when it's empty. When silence is informed, it becomes a weapon. Every moment I didn't react, every time I let them believe I was behind, I was actually stepping further ahead. They mistook my restraint for weakness because they had never learned how to control themselves. I also learned something harder about cruelty. Cruelty doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it wears calm faces and professional language. Sometimes it hides behind what's best and moving forward. And the most damaging cruelty comes from people who believe they're entitled to you. That meeting taught me to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided not to understand, to stop offering softness where there was no respect. Strength doesn't mean becoming cold, but it does mean becoming precise. Most of all, I learned that you don't owe access to anyone who treats your value as negotiable. Not family, not colleagues, not history. If someone needs you smaller to feel powerful, they don't deserve proximity to your future. I didn't walk out of that room changed. I walked out confirmed. And that certainty, quiet, grounded, unshakable, was the real win.